That was part of the credit sequence for the opening of an episode of Battlestar Galactica. Now, from a storytelling point of view, I must confess that always used to bug me a little bit because it's basically just a big fat clip of spoilers for the rest of the episode. But I've put it here because it's a good example of the use of tempo, which is the viewpoint we're going to be looking at today. So tempo. We spend most of our time in most of our life in an ordinary, everyday, average kind of tempo. Most of the time, we're in this narrow band of everyday, average tempo. And so good shows knock us out of that tempo, out of that everyday tempo, and into something new, something that we don't normally experience, which is what that example from Battlestar Galactica does. They use that close to the start of the episode to get us excited about the episode that's coming up, because it's a different tempo from what we live in. We have fast-running scenes accompanied by a tribal, fast-moving beat to bring that tempo up. This is also why, for example, James Bond films traditionally open with an action sequence. Again, to knock us out of our everyday, comfortable tempo and take us into the exciting, action-packed tempo of James Bond. But you don't have to accelerate tempo in order to knock us out of everyday tempo. There are other ways to do it, as we'll see in this clip. So imagine the context that this clip was put in. It's in between other ads that are playing. Usually most of those ads will have a very fast talking voice that's trying to cram as much information as it possibly can into 30 seconds to make sure that you'll come down to the store and buy. And then you end up instead in an advert that is going in this slow motion tempo. And the whole ad takes place in this beautiful slow motion, pulling you out of the horrible fast tempo of all those other ads. And it stays there, except for that one moment when the table explodes forward and we see his legs fling out in front of him as well. Beautiful use of shape, by the way. And then we return to the slow motion tempo after the violence of that one moment to bring us into the embrace life sequence. The definition of tempo from Anne Bogart's work: the speed at which a movement occurs, or how fast or slow something happens on stage, or in our case, on screen. Now when we talk about tempos, there are different kinds of tempos we can look at. There is the character tempo, which we'll be looking at predominantly through the rest of this since we're looking at acting. But there's also the tempo of the scene. So the pace at which the scene moves, which is influenced by how fast the actors move and interact and the background characters, but also things like the direction, the DP, the editing, the music and the soundtrack as well. So the clip that we just looked at, the tempo was predominantly the influence of the scene, the director, the choice of music, the choice to slow down and run that whole thing in slow motion. But if you looked at the characters, they were also doing some lovely tempo work as well. So even though the whole scene was in slow motion, within each character they had their own tempo. They had the everyday family having fun together tempo, and then we moved quickly into the accident, horrible thing about to happen, let's save dad tempo, and then back into the thank God we're safe and I love my life tempo. All of which was kind of masked by the scene tempo because it was going so slow that the other tempos of the characters weren't so predominant, but they were there. Different places have different tempos. This seems obvious, but it's another thing to take into account aside from character tempo, scene tempo. Also, different places have different tempos. Just about everything we encounter in life has a tempo associated with it. So for example, Singapore has a particular kind of tempo. If you go to Sydney, if you go to Kuala Lumpur, if you go to Jakarta, they will all have their own different tempo that is slightly unique, at least to them. And it's a tempo that you will be influenced by and perhaps even take on as you spend more time in each of those different cities. Similarly, of course, if you go to a village, it's going to have a completely different tempo. But they're also dependent on the circumstances. If you go to a village where there's a fire happening, then the tempo is going to be much faster at the village. And, of course, different places within the same city will have different tempos too. So Singapore has its own tempo, but there is a different tempo in the Botanical Gardens, to the Marina Bay Sands, to LaSalle College of the Arts, to the MRT. So, now to explore tempo further, let's have a look at where we get the word from. Music. So we'll start by listening to some beats and then we'll listen to some music. As I play these beats, tap out the rhythm or move to the rhythm. Try bobbing your head, moving your shoulders, or moving parts of your body in time with the rhythm. What kind of character does this rhythm suggest to you? Think about what character would move this quickly, what might cause you to move this quickly. What circumstance might have this tempo? Now we're going to listen to some music. So music, like all the other arts, like drama, like animation, there's lots more to it than just tempo. So we might get carried away in the feel of it, the pitch or the key or the mood of the music. But for the most part, see if you can stick to responding to the tempo. Inner tempo and outer tempo. So the inner tempo is the speed of someone's thoughts, their heartbeat, or their breathing. All those things that are going on within the body or within the mind that are hard to perceive from outside. And the outer tempo, the speed of the person's movements. And these may vary or be different at different times. So for example, If you see a horror movie, you might see someone who is terrified but glued to the spot, unable to move from the monster. But their heart will be racing and their breathing will be very fast. A character's tempo will vary with many different things, as will most of the other viewpoints. They all respond, of course, to time of day, mood, culture, background, age, gender, anything at all that influences your character's life basically will influence their tempo and their other viewpoints, which means that a character's tempo will and should vary throughout a scene, throughout the entire show, and different characters within the shows we also expect to have different tempos. If you've seen a show that you thought was boring or draggy, it may be because the tempo wasn't varied. Either the tempo of the actors or the tempo of the piece as a whole, as set by the director and the writer. It may have instead sat in that ordinary, everyday, average tempo. So, as you go for a break, this is the end of part 1, listen to your internal tempo, listen to the rhythm of your heartbeat, or if you need to, take your pulse so you can feel that rhythm, that beat that's coming from within you. You can also try listening to your breath, or even listening to the pace of thoughts within your mind. So, this is the end of part 1. Have a listen to your internal tempo, then grab a drink, have a quick break, and then come back for part 2.